The trailblazer in a transformational setting is a person who's prepared to go where no one's gone before. They don't have maps. Indeed, they are the map makers. All a trailblazer needs is a clear sense of direction. Which way am I headed? Which way do you want me to go, Mr. Jefferson? He said, go west to Lewis and Clark. He didn't say, now go to the first road and turn right and then go to another road and turn left. They didn't have global positioning system, but let me tell you what they did have, the North Star. So they didn't know where they were going to be tonight, but they knew which direction to head tomorrow morning because they had some signposts. And they understood the signals, and they understood the habits of nature. They knew which way, they knew water ran downhill, and they knew there was a divide, and if most of it was running east, and sometime you're going to get to a divide and it's going to run west. And so they had some clear signs, but they didn't know where they were going. We had the same thing with the space program. I'm old enough to remember when the space program started. You aren't, most of you. I remember when the first time, I think it might have been John Glenn, but it was one of those early astronauts who started reporting back as they were coming in about the beautiful fireflies that were going by the windows. They were. About burned him up. Because what was happening was that stuff on the outside was burning and sending sparks by his windows. But he had no way of knowing what he was seeing. They had no experience. And so he put the only interpretations on it that he could put on it. He put on it understandings that were really not, it turned out not to be valid, but that's what the trailblazer does. The trailblazer has a basis of making guesses, but they make a lot of guesses, they make a lot of mistakes, they take some wrong turns, and they're not as efficient as people who come after them, who have the trails that they blazed to follow. Trailblazers are independent sorts. And quite often what trailblazers do if they don't have good leadership is they blaze trails all over the place, and some of them lead to some place and some of them don't, but they serve no good end. They are personal direction as opposed to a collective direction. And so what you wind up with is chaos as opposed to some direction. And this is what often happens in our schools. We get 3 or 4 trailblazers, one of whom wants to blaze a trail this way, and one wants to blaze a trail that way, another wants to blaze a trail that way, and so we go north, south, east, and west. Sounds like a school board to me. They don't have a common direction. And so what they do is set 5 goals. 1 goal for each board member. And because each board member has a different direction they want to go, you wind up going no place because you're going 5 different places and they're pulling against each other, as opposed to how do you hook them up and go in the same direction. You may go in the same direction differently, but you go in the same direction as opposed to going in different directions. So the trailblazer is a character that's very important in this operation, but don't think they're the only important character. There's a lot of other important characters. Too often people, when I made this presentation 25 years ago, saw this person as a hero in the play. This is the one that was the most important. Hell, they're a pain in the neck. Quite often they're distractions because they get bored. They want to go ahead. They're not really particular working with other people. They want to do it alone. And what they really want and what they really need is some degree of praise and honor for being so brave. They love to create rendezvous, you know. They come back to the rendezvous and man, you don't know how tough we've had it. In spite of the fact our principal's stupid, in spite of the fact that the school board's crazy, in spite of the fact that my colleagues are all Neanderthals, the matter of fact is I've done some wonderful things and we've learned that we can do some great things, and they brag about it. They want bragging rights. Well, you got to satisfy that somehow, but you got to also understand there's more to it than having your ego satisfied. Behind the trailblazer comes the pioneer. The pioneer has a lot of characteristics in common with the trailblazer, but the pioneer has to know that the place is worth going to. They're going to have to know enough from the trailblazer to say, is there water out there? Is the land pretty? And Daniel Boone had to say Rebecca. Rebecca was the pioneer in the family. Daniel was the trailblazer. And Daniel had to come back and say, Becky, that Kentucky country is beautiful. He didn't tell her how poor it was. He just said, it's beautiful. He said, and you'll like it. And there's a lot of free land out there and all the things we've always wanted. If we can just get there as a family, we can settle and we can get things you value Now the pioneer's ready to go. They don't have to say how long is the trip going to take. They don't have to say how many people are going to get killed on the way. They don't have to say, can you get there? Well, Daniel said, yeah, you can get there. I got there. Blaze a trail through the Cumberland Gap. I know exactly how to get there. And I got a place picked out where we can build a fort. And on and on and on and on. All that stuff is taken care of. So that the pioneer said, I'll go. They don't need a lot of assurance that anybody else is going on. Quite often pioneers come in very small family groups, little intimate clusters. Ever sound like school to you? Those few people who go away to a workshop and get all excited and come back and they want to take the trip. And they're all excited about it. Now everybody else kind of watching what's going on. Behind the Trailblazer are the settlers. Now the settlers, they're most of us. Settlers are a brave lot, but they got to have a lot of questions answered before they go. If we take this trip, if we start to transform ourselves, if we really start trying to think about ourselves as guides to instruction, and if we begin to say, how do we provide instruction for people if we don't provide it? What would our school look like if we organize it this way? And they start asking those questions, they want you to have some answers. Because they're not going to go on a trip until they know how many beans we're going to have to take along, how many days it's going to take, just how many workshops you see I'd have to go to. Now, how long is it going to be before this is implemented? What happens if the principal leaves? I've heard the wind blow before, so now we got another person comes in with another hot idea. And so and I got to have all that answered if I'm going to move the settlers. They need an awful lot of support. They need a lot of encouragement, some of them more than others, but they need to understand that there are things here that I need, that if I don't need them, I don't see them. And by the way, are my friends going along? I'm not going to go unless there's a wagon train. Then there's stay-at-homes. Stay-at-homes are people that don't want to go themselves. They don't mind if you do. They might even cover your class for you while you're off to those workshops. They say things like, you know, we went through this too. And that's part of being young, you know, you got to have this. We did some of this. I remember we had this wild-eyed principal came in here with the idea of doing X, Y, or Z. And I got sucked into it, and I did it. And it was kind of exciting for a little while. You know, I was thinking of my grandfather. You know, I had two, like most folks, I had two grandfathers. One was literally was a village atheist, and the other was a local fundamentalist Methodist preacher. Now, if you think that wasn't an interesting family talk at Thanksgiving time. But the village atheist grandfather was very conservative, very moralistic, very strict, probably more so than the Methodist preacher, by the way. But he and I would have great discussions about this and that and something else. And I went away to Ohio State University, and I went back to graduate school at about the time Bob Dylan was starting to groan and moan. You know who Dylan was. And he was singing all these songs, and we were growing beards, and you know, up until about the late 50s, in a small town in Ohio, you just didn't have anybody with beards except the Luden brothers, you know, people, Smith brothers on the Luden cough drop box, but people just didn't grow face hair. But then it became a mark of protest to grow face hair. And so, not to be outdone, I got my sandals, and I got my beads, and I got my beard. And I couldn't wait to come home to my grandfather, who lived across the field from us. They'd built a house right down the road from us. And so I came to my parents. First thing I did was walk down to my granddad with my flowing beard, because I knew he was going to raise hell. You know, I mean, I knew he was going to have all kind of ugly things to say to me about my beard. And I couldn't wait, because then we get into a great debate about freedom and, you know, all the stuff we used to discuss. And he had a habit, you know, I was old enough by that time that he taught me the art of drinking what I call a poor man's Manhattan. He made dandelion wine. Now, if you've never tasted dandelion wine, don't. But he would take half a water glass full of dandelion wine, which is sweet. Then he'd pour the rest of it full of the cheapest bourbon he could buy and pour it in there with no ice. And you're supposed to drink that and say, boy, that's good. And so he'd always toddle over and get it out of his cabinet and pour it, and we'd sit there. And I kept talking to him about this and that and something, waiting for him to say something about my beard. And finally, I got enough of the dandelion wine in me to get up my courage, and I said, "Granddad, what do you think of my beard?" He said, "Well, everybody got to have something to be ashamed of when they get older." Well, he was a stay-at-home. You can grow a beard if you want to. I'm not going to. The last person, I remember, some of the old boys in the 1880s and 90s and 1900 had beards. But that's over with. And if you want to do that, go ahead. But you'll get over it. Stay-at-home is a relatively harmless sort. There's one behind them that's not so harmless. And that's the saboteur. The saboteur not only does not want to transform, he doesn't want anybody else to. And he's opposed to it, or she's opposed to it. And they spend their time trying to lay traps to make sure that you don't make it. Now, one of the dangers, of course, and I'll talk about this later in another context, one of the dangers is too often we confuse saboteurs with people who, in a prior campaign, were trailblazers. And they got betrayed by their leadership. And they say, "Get me once, shame on you. Get me twice, shame on me." I've seen this stuff come and go. And so we look at them, we think they're saboteurs. But they're really very potentially trailblazers again, if we can just light their fire right. But we need to think about that. Another thing we need to think about as we look at the stay-at-homes. The stay-at-homes won't cause you any trouble unless you start putting pressure on them to change. And then they'll join the saboteurs. If you're going to go after, and if you go after the saboteur first, then as a stay-at-home, I'm going to say, if they're going to make old Harry go, they're going to get me. So what I better do is join a coalition with Harry right now and stop this mess before it gets too far down the road. And so you wind up, if you're not very careful in the early stages of a change process or a transformation process of creating resistance to change by the way you deal with the saboteurs and the stay-at-homes. And if you deal with them too aggressively, you create more resistance rather than less. Now that's the actors on the stage. Now I'll give you the stage. Most of us like to think that if change is going right, that's the way it goes. Every day and every way we get better and better. And every day and every way we see more and more about it and we get more enthusiastic about it and people want to jump into it and really like it. But that's not the way that it happens. The way it happens is more like this. For the trailblazer and the pioneer, what I described does work. The pioneer has enough energy and he has enough direction that he doesn't go down that, what I'm going to call enthusiasm gully or gulch. He doesn't give up. He makes a relatively straight line because he knows where he's going, what direction he's headed. So he doesn't get discouraged because indeed discouragement is encouragement. If it's tough and I do it, by golly, I got something to brag about when I get back home. So he's getting a lot of intrinsic rewards out of the adversity that he experiences. Pioneer's the same way. The pioneer will make it across this chasm relatively unscathed. But where we get in trouble is when the settlers start out and they fall off and you start out and about 6 months into it, nobody told me it's going to be this hard. And they start falling down, and they get down in the bottom of implementation, or in the bottom of enthusiasm gulch. I used to call it the implementation dip. Now there's a good lesson for you. When I first presented this, I talked about this gully as implementation dip following Michael Fullen's notion of the implementation dip. But I found it conveyed the wrong message because people being concerned as they are about test scores thought I was saying what was going to happen is test scores are going to go down. No, enthusiasm for the transformation is going to go down, not test scores. This had nothing to do with the performance of the system. The system just keeps on perking. But what doesn't happen is if you're really trying to transform the system, the enthusiasm that people have for the change and the hard work that it takes to bring it about, people say, I've had all this fun I can stand, and I'm going to go back home. And as a consequence, they go back home. And the reason they go back, there's several reasons they go back home, but chief among them is this is the best time for the saboteurs to work. When people are really tired out and lonesome, and they feel like they're oppressed, suppressed, and depressed, And the old saboteur comes along on the train now. And he says, you know, I told you this is going to happen. I warned you, I was had that way back in the 1960s. Let me tell you, it wasn't going to be any good to begin with. Now let's all go back to where we were. Let's go, and now the stay-at-homes, they start supporting the saboteur. They say, honey, we were tolerant, we let you do this stuff, but we've had about all this messing around. The journey is abandoned because of lack of committed leaders, for one thing. When the going gets tough, leadership says, you know, maybe that's not right. You see that a lot. You know, there's a lot of witchcraft in our schools. A lot of times educational leaders are like witch doctors. Particularly in the Hopi Indian tribe, you know, when they had the rain dances, and you have this witch doctor who begins to suspect that dancing isn't going to bring the rain, but he's afraid not to dance just in case that it does. What would happen if I don't dance and then the rain doesn't come? I'll be blamed for it. So I'll go through the rain dance, and we get the same thing with test prep and a whole bunch of other stuff. We know it probably doesn't do the good stuff we want it to do, but by golly, what if I don't do it? And then my class doesn't score like the other classes, then I'll be blamed for it. So what I better do is dance, just in case, just in case. You know, my mother taught me that just in case stuff, and I'm 75 years old. And one of the things I still have trouble with, my mother, when I was a little boy, from the time I was a little boy on up, always said, if you go out and you forget something, you come back in the house, you better sit down. Because if you don't sit down in the house after you've gone out, then that's bad luck. And she drilled that into me until I was, you know, now I don't believe it anymore. But if I forget something, I sit down just in case. You understand what I'm saying? We have an awful lot of just in case behavior in our schools. We don't think that what they're telling us is right, but we don't trust our own judgment enough to really stand up to it and say, I'll stand for what I believe. I hope what you see and what you heard helps you understand the trip that you're on. That you're going to have to choose whether you're going to be a trailblazer or a settler or a pioneer or a stay-at-home, or even if you're going to be a saboteur. If you think people are on the wrong trip, I wouldn't be a saboteur. They tend to get sneaky. But I'd be an open agitator. I'd say, hey, I think this is the wrong trip. And let me tell you the 7 reasons why I think it's the wrong trip. Or I think it's the right trip, but we got the wrong equipment. Or we got the wrong scouts, and we got the wrong guides, and we got the wrong, but you're going to have to choose. But what you can't choose, I would argue, is not to take a trip. You, unlike my generation, see, I came in when Sputnik went up in 1957. I started teaching shortly thereafter. And we had all kind of enthusiasm and so forth and so on, but we didn't really change much. We should have, but we didn't. We weren't smart enough to know what to change. But we had a choice. The schools went on for my entire career pretty much the way they were when we started. They're not going to go on for your entire career. If you have more than 20 years left, it's over with for you if we don't bring about fundamental changes in schools. We're going to have 2 education systems. We'll have a privatized education system, not private schools, because private schools are in as much trouble as public schools are. They just don't know it yet. But we'll have a privatized system of education where people will be hired to be facilitators of learning and designers of work, and where parents will get together and have a voucher. There'll be an education voucher to buy hardware, software, and pay for tutors. And they will it'll be home-based, school-based, and community-based education. And that will be for the affluent. And poor kids will be in state-run, test-driven, highly accountable in the sense that we now talk about accountability, highly accountable to the state kind of system. And that will be for the poor kids, and particularly poor children of color. And they'll learn to decode words. They won't learn to understand what they read, but they'll be able to get words off of a page. But they won't be taught to write poetry. They'll learn how to write brief descriptive paragraphs about poems that somebody else wrote. But they'll never learn the joy of writing poetry, the joy of writing music, the joy of listening to good music. They'll be too busy learning how to do the stuff that needs to be done in order to pass the test. And that's where we have to end tonight. Tomorrow we're going to talk about standards and the way standards fit into all this. Thank you very much.